that's the one that you have to use. You're not going to cut anybody off, are you?
No.
Which you could do, but that's for you. So
Right.
let's turn it on. It's green.
Okay, I think we'll assume everyone's here who's coming here tonight. Good evening, and welcome to this meeting of the Audit Governance and Standards Committee. I've been advised there are no fire drills planned for tonight, but if the alarm does sound, Mrs. Snook here will ascertain the situation, that's what it says here, and provide further instructions. I would remind you that this meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Maidstone Borough Council website. I don't see any sign of anybody else looking to record it, so I think I'll move on. Members who are using mobile phones or tablets are asked to please ensure that these are on silent and are only being used with regard to the business on the agenda this evening. Some members and officers may not be familiar with the new microphones. Anybody not familiar with them? I'll tell you anyway. To speak, press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. End of training. Once you've finished speaking, please press the middle button again and it will turn white. Okay, so moving on to the agenda, if I may. Apologies for absence, Debbie.
We've received apologies from Councillor Perry.
And notification of substitute members. Sorry.
Councillor Burton substituting for Councillor Perry.
Thank you. Nobody else? Before moving to notification of visiting members, I have agreed to take the management response to the critical recommendation arising from the internal audit review of Hazlitt Centre contract monitoring as an urgent item, as it provides an update on matters to be considered at the meeting. Everybody happy about that? Thank you. Okay, notification of visiting members, I see none. Disclosures by members and officers? None. Disclosures of lobbying? None. Any items to be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information? None. Okay, let's move on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of September. Going through these, shall we do it page by page? Page 1. Page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, 7, and lastly, page 8. Can I sign those? Thank you. Would you just like to comment on something, and as you say, Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to update members on item 30, external audit procurement. Following the resolution of this committee last time, we'll be taking a report to Council in December with proposals about appointment of auditors for the future.
May I comment?
Yes, Peter.
On item
26 of the agenda, the final bullet. Page 2 of the agenda. I'd like to register a thank you to the officer who provided an answer to that. I think it may have been Donna Price, forgive me. Yes, it was Donna Price. And I'd like to thank her because in the penultimate paragraph of her briefing, it makes clear where the responsibilities of the Borough Council start and where they stop in terms of complaints about parish councillors. Thank you.
I take it that means you're happy with it then?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
If I may just raise a point on page 4, the bullet point, second bullet point up from the bottom. I don't know, Ellie, if this is in your court. The collection rate was very high and monitored closely. More information relating to the collection statistics would be circulated to all members of the committee and to the parish council representatives. I don't think it's actually happened yet.
Shall I take that? Yes, we haven't done that as yet, and apologies for not having done so, but we can arrange to circulate that information.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to agenda item 8, the committee work programme. Does anybody have any comments on that, or do we just note it? Noted? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Daly. Okay, agenda item 9, report of the Head of Policy and Communications, Annual Governance Statement 2015-16, Plan Update. Mrs Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chairman. This is the mid-year update on the Annual Governance Statement Action Plan. The Action Plan is focused on the governance issues raised from reviewing our governance arrangements for 2015-16, as identified in the Annual Governance Statement, which was presented to this committee in July. Action has been taken in all areas identified, as you can see from Appendix A. Risk management is covered on another item on this agenda, as is the item on the audit reviews with a weak assurance rating if you're looking for more information on those matters, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any comments on this? No? Yes, Councillor.
Just a note for future reference. It may be that the document will need to be updated after the member sounding board for communications has had its first meeting. I mean, it's just a note for future reference that it's likely that that section on communication with residents will need to be updated at some time in the coming year.
Can I just ask, we're looking at an action plan relating to last year's annual government statement. I think this is what confused me a bit. So I did actually look it up. I see the last page are the actions which have been carried forward to 16-17. When's the next governance statement due to be produced?
So we'll produce the next governance statement. Will be produced in May. It will probably come to this committee in June or July, and that's a look back at this year. And then there'll be an action plan for next year based on that review. They're always backward-looking with a forward-facing action plan. I appreciate it's a bit confusing.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're asked to note the governance statement action plan. Is that noted? Thank you very much. Moving on, the report of the Head of Audit Partnership, Interim Internal Audit and Assurance Report. Is that you, Rich? It's all yours.
Thank you, Chairman. This is our mid-year report examining progress we've made against the audit plan that this committee agreed back in March. It includes sort of practical details about the work we've completed and how long we've taken to complete it, plus summaries of findings and some additional commentary. I'll run through the main messages of the report if I may, but I'm happy to take questions as I go along or at the end as members prefer. Turning first to, beyond the introduction, page 23, includes some commentary here related to an overall note from the findings of our work to date. We wouldn't always include this kind of commentary at this stage, but we thought it worth drawing to members' attention that there are a cluster of weak assurance rated reports on the following page, which share certain characteristics that we've highlighted to managers as areas, management for areas to note when they consider controls for the rest of the year, and noted to members likewise, which is weaknesses on what we call the second line of defence. I've included on page 22 a chart setting out what I mean by that. Specifically, it's those controls which kick in the event that the primary control either fails or is subverted. So what are the internal measures that act as a safety net when your first line of controls fail? And this includes things like contract management, like risk management, like system-based controls. And it's been a feature of a number of the reviews that we've undertaken so far this year and reported that it's at this point where we're seeing control weaknesses. So this is something that we highlighted to management as an emerging theme fairly early on. What I would say is to reassure members is that we haven't found those weaknesses as any of the core functions of the authority. Maidstone has a good record of positive assurance ratings with respect to its core financial systems. And although our work in those areas would typically take place later in the year, nothing that we've found to date would suggest to us increased likelihood of finding weaknesses at that level. Rather, where we have found the weaknesses are areas where the council is moving into new areas of business or new ways of working through third parties or with new systems, and some of the summaries are there. Moving on from that overall message, at the bottom of page 23 is some details of how far progressed we are through the plan in terms of the number of days. As I say, a lot of our particularly heavy project financial systems work happens later in the year, so I'm comfortable that the progress we have to date will see us complete the plan by the end of 2016-17. Moving across pages 24 and 25 is the summary of the work we've completed to date, and further on from that, from pages 26 onwards, are the summary findings of those completed reports. On page 29 of the papers, deal with the audit recommendations that we've raised. Obviously, a key component of the work that we do is where we have findings, is we raise recommendations to management to allow them to address those findings and put right control weaknesses or seize opportunities that we present to them. We have a 5-point scale, critical, high, medium, low and advisory. And of particular note in this update is the first time that we've raised a critical audit recommendation. As members will see, this arises from the work that we undertook at the Hazlitt Theatre, and it particularly relates to the adequacy of some of the fire doors within the building, which had initially been raised in a ROSPA, which is the Royal Society for Prevention of Accidents risk assessment, earlier in 2016, and hadn't been addressed by the time we undertook the audit. Now, because of that finding, because it's a publicly accessible venue, because of the fire risk there, we raised this immediately as a critical recommendation, which meant it existed outside of our normal processes, and we raised it immediately with directors. This report is being finalised quite late on in the process. The final report was only received to us last week. And so We felt it necessary to raise with members as soon as we found it, as we did with directors, and it's also led to the paper that we've tabled this evening, which is management's full response to the recommendation. So with the initial response on the first page and further information for members crossing onto the reverse side of the sheet. So apologies for that coming to you late, but we wanted to bring it to you as soon as we had it, hence its tabling this evening. Beyond that, across pages 30 and 31, more information about the recommendations that we've raised, and the Council is, with one exception, on track with implementing those recommendations, which is a positive picture for the authority and indicative of the strong working relationship we have with officers to raise recommendations that they're able to implement. Page 31 runs through those findings, those reports which had reported a weak assurance rating, some of which we've been able, through the implementation of recommendations, to upgrade our assurance rating, some of which the work is still ongoing to bring them back up to that level. From page 32 onwards, deals with the work that we undertake to give us confidence on the Council's corporate governance, which includes the work we undertake in the fields of fraud and corruption. Obviously, this committee will be well versed in the whistleblowing policy, which the committee approved at its last meeting. That's now been launched to Council staff, and we've already had a couple of issues raised with us, neither of which have resulted in serious findings, but it's good to know that the message is out there and those processes appear to be bringing forth information. That's part of what we hope will be a broader revisit of the Council's counter-fraud policies across 2017, off of the back of the Cabinet Office instituting national standards which are not compulsory and will not be compulsory for local government, but nevertheless represent best practice in counter-fraud, and so naturally something that we would want to look to when considering what arrangements ought to be in place at Maidstone. Across pages 33 and 34 deals with the findings to date with the work we've undertaken on the National Fraud Initiative, which is a national data matching service run by the Cabinet Office, where the Council, like every other local authority and a number of private sector and other public sector entities, upload data, payroll, service users, insurance claimants, housing benefit claimants and the like. That data is then matched by the Cabinet Office and returned to us with indications of matches which may potentially indicate a fraud. Things like someone claiming housing benefits simultaneously to two local authorities, that type of affair, which we then investigate. And so far, of the 3,500 matches we have examined, 55 cases of error have been identified, saving the Council just over £23,000. Of course, the table in the bottom shows that somewhat pales into insignificance against the national picture, with 48,000 errors almost found and 86 million recovered across the public sector. But nevertheless, Maidstone has had some success with the programme. Page 35 onwards deals with some of the work we've undertaken in risk management. Those of you who attended the briefing before this session will have seen a lot of this information already, but to summarise for those who are unable to attend, this sets out the work that we've taken in enhancing the Council's risk management approach, which has already borne fruit in terms of the responses and the papers we've had to Policy and Resources Committee. And at the bottom of page 35 is a summary of the key corporate risks that were identified through that process. Page 37 onwards is an update on Mccann Audit as a Service, highlighting that we've got a new trainee on the team who joined us from our admin role, so very pleased to have her now working with us full-time, which has allowed us to join in with the Council's apprentice scheme. There isn't an apprentice role for audit, so we've never been able to join in, but there is an apprentice role for administrators, so we were able to offer a job to a local young person, Shabazz Rahman, who I understand is watching this evening. And so we welcome him to the team. Set out across the remainder of 37 and 38 some of the information that we're required to report to you under audit standards about our independence, and to affirm once again that I have not been subjected to any undue pressure or influence by management in reporting the findings to you this evening or at any other time. And then finally on page 39 is some of the performance indicators that we report to Shared Service Board and others And I'm particularly pleased on this occasion to be able to report to members that, with the exception of recommendations implemented, which is not wholly within our gift, we are at or above targets for all of these indicators, which I'm really pleased to report as an exceptionally strong performance, especially given, as I note in paragraph 68, the magnitude of some of the improvements in those which we've seen over the past 2 and a bit years, which really leads me into the final paragraph there, giving my thanks to the team who work for me and with me to complete our work and deliver that strong performance. And as a final, just for information, one of the things that we've done recently is updated our Audit Manual, and on page 40 is our manual on a page, our process map. If anybody wanted to know exactly how we get to this point, this provides a nice, colourful way of seeing how we get to where we are tonight. I'm happy to take any questions from members on the report.
Thank you, Rich. Yes, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for being a little bit late this evening. Can I look at page 23 and then 31, paragraph 9, refers to Moat Park Cafe, which is a new area of business for us, apparently, and then turn to page 31, where it refers on the next to end section, Moat Park and Cobtree Cafe, and it talks about continuing discrepancies in takings reconciliations. I believe that we contract these out, so I'm just wondering what the situation is. Are the contractors aware that there are discrepancies in takings? I mean, I presume this is cash takings we're talking about, and obviously in this sort of cafe-type institution, there are always problems, or at least there have to be careful noting of whether cash totals are correct. So is this something that we are missing out as a council, or is it something that the contractors are missing out? And where does this lie? Where's the ratio?
For many years, the cafe service was contracted out, but the council brought it back in-house last year. Yes, towards the end of last year. So this is an in-house operation that we examined in the spring. What we found was that, among other things, the takings reconciliation at the end of the day, each day, was seldom correct. We were satisfied enough that this wasn't a fraud risk because the variation went up and down and didn't indicate a particular fraud issue that concerned us greatly. Naturally, we made a recommendation that the reconciliation should be addressed and should be made more accurate. What we found on re-examining the recommendation this summer was that whilst Moat Park Cafe had hit the mark with respect to controls, that wasn't true as much as we'd like at Cobtree Cafe. And so we provided further advice on reconciliations and have been following up that recommendation in the past few weeks, which will be in our next report to management.
Just come back on that. The Heritage, Culture and Leisure Committee, in which I sit, were firmly assured that, in fact, we still had a contract running the Moat Park Cafe. So perhaps I'll have to put them straight at the next meeting.
I'm advised you might be thinking about the Leisure Centre Cafe. But this is the one above the lake we're talking about for the purposes of this report.
I would say it's my understanding that we took that one under our own control. So I would well, maybe you better put the Heritage and Committee straight then. Okay. Yes, Councillor English.
Just a general observation that I think like a lot of other committee reports, the treatment of cross-cutting matters in this whole agenda and the treatment of whether a report, how what a report for noting actually means on this, and a lot of other agendas for the council is totally inconsistent. Which is an issue I shall be returning to later, but it's not at P&R rather than here. But we actually do need to make sure that our treatment of reports is the same. I'm not having to go at you, Rich, because I think your treatment is actually correct in this report and the others are probably not. But we can't have a situation where we have a treatment of cross-cutting issues for a report that's being noted, and in some committees, those include issues for decision in the cross-cutting elements of the report, which is quite inappropriate. Then we have another report for noting, which says that because it's a report for noting, it doesn't treat those issues. We've got to be consistent. We've also got to have recommendations on the agendas that actually say what they're for. And the next, there's one later on this agenda, which doesn't actually set out the recommendation correctly. But turning to the substance of this report, it's very disappointing, despite all the work that councillors of all parties have put in relation to Section 106 agreements, that we are still in such a poor situation. And despite all the efforts that have been made, we are still, for want of a proper handling of this issue, at risk of returning far greater sums of money to developers than we are to, because we are scrimping on the input. And that's part of the problem. But the other problem is we actually have departments within the council who are unwilling to actually spend the money. So I wouldn't want to say that the recommendations need to address not just the weaknesses in the process of dealing with it, which are addressed here, I think, but I think they also need to, going forward, to address the reluctance within certain service departments to actually ask for and spend money in a reasonable period of time, which is seems to be an omission of this report, which is understandable because obviously the focus would in the first instance come on the planning function. But it seems to me, and a lot of councillors are involved in this, that that's only part of the problem, and any solution must look at both ends of the equation.
Yeah, that's an important point that you raise. I mean, I'm loath to give money back to developers that they've been contracted to make available for improvements relative to sites. I wonder, do we have within the council a single point of control of 106 agreements, or does it rest with the individual planning officers concerned? Who's responsible?
It's dealt with within the planning department, and there is an officer who coordinates all of the accounting and monitoring of Section 106s. I know because I met her last week and I went through the processes with her, so there is that central point of contact and control.
And do we know how much money we've had to give back to developers that's referred to in the report?
I don't have a figure. I don't know whether Rich established that in carrying out the audit.
We did, but I don't have it in front of me, and I wouldn't like to attempt to remember it in public, so I'm happy to consult with the report and circulate that separately if you wish.
I think we need to get a spotlight on this, and how we do that from this committee's point of view, I'm not quite sure, but perhaps I can leave it with you to come back to us with a suggestion on how this might be tackled. It's a key issue. I wasn't aware of this other point of an inherent reluctance to spend money on our part, but this isn't the forum probably for discussion.
No, I did not want to go into how, why and when in public, but I think some members are aware of the issue.
Okay. Yes, Councillor Burton.
Comment to add, within planning there is a planning review that is just beginning to be undertaken, and I think 106 collection and implementation will be one of many facets of that review. So it's coming very much into the spotlight and on the radar.
My point, Mr. Chairman, was that we shouldn't just look at the planning point. It's a two-ended problem.
Well, my attention is also drawn to the comments regarding the Hazlitt contract. If we're talking about contracts and their implementation, it's a bit of a loose link, I agree, but it's the best I can do for that moment. But it does say, if I can quickly turn it up, for example, we found the council has not sought a business plan for the theatre, confirmed health and safety arrangements, or settled how Parkwood should record and report its performance. Now, these are fundamental elements of the contract we had with them. And, you know, if we were to audit the contract, as you have in finding this, there's got to be a hole somewhere in our procedures that need looking at. And that factor alarms me. And I think, again, we need to bring the spotlight in more on how we are implementing our contracts. The cafeteria, again, it's a loose connection, but the project management of the cafeterias could fall under the same category. So this whole area of contract implementation, I think needs more attention. And I would like some feedback at this committee on what we're doing about that.
I note absolutely the comments that you make, Mr. Chairman, and as a management team, we do take the findings of those audits very seriously. Rich pointed out in his report, paragraph 10 on page 23, that these findings have been taken on board, and certainly we're happy to report back on progress with implementing the recommendations, but make no mistake, we do take the issues raised seriously.
Yes, looking at page 23, the last sentence in paragraph 10 says, inevitably these measures will take some time before their effects show through in our audit findings, and I do find the some time a little bit vague. It's probably not under your control as to how long it's going to take, but perhaps we should be asking people how long they're going to take to do it, so we get a better feel for it.
I think the point here is that it'll take some time for the measures to be, the effectiveness of the measures to be demonstrated through audits. That's not saying that the measures themselves won't be taken quickly.
Fine. Mr. Cooling.
I'd like to support the Chair very strongly, if I may, because the Hazlitt, forgive my accent, example shows that something which is pretty serious has slipped under the bar. And I don't think this is so much an audit issue. Presumably all outsourced services should be subject to regular service level report, exception report. There should be a regular monitoring of all discharge of responsibilities, and then audit. The audit role would be to check that those reports are forthcoming and are acted upon. So I don't think it's audit. And if this points to a failure to monitor outsourced contracts, then it's a pretty serious failure.
Any comment, gentlemen? No?
I agree.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Yes, Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Chairman. It's this question of arm's length, what I call arm's length management. When you start to commission other people to take on what the council had previously had as its own role, whilst you allow them, whoever it may be, to do the day-to-day management and the running of whatever it is, in this case it's the Hazlitt Theatre, for example, but it could be anything else. It could be the cafe, it could be a whole raft of things. It says in here that we should have some sort of oversight and the ability to control or to have reports back on certain things. And the weakness is on our side on this, it appears. And I'm grateful, in fact, to the auditors for picking this up, because otherwise we wouldn't know about it until sometimes it's too late. But in this particular case, I find it quite fascinating, actually, that The fire doors, which after all are quite an important part of a building, whatever building it is, if you haven't got a pole to slide down, you want to know how to get out and get out quickly. I'm just surprised actually that so many of them have become damaged, and I'm quite interested to know how that happened, particularly the fourth wall, which after all was the last one to be established. You may remember it was about 4 or 5 years ago. We had a lot of sound going through from one side to the other, and the void in the middle was the cause of it. So we shut it off with a set of doors on each side, and that cured it. Now, if that is the case in here, as it says, that those are the ones which are the most damaged, I'd be quite interested to know how that happened. But nevertheless, and notwithstanding all that, the business of open to surveying, management, performance, and then arrangements to deliver oversight of, amongst other, building maintenance, profitability, business planning and complaints. I mean, you're almost running the thing, although you've handed it over to somebody else. You want to do the whole thing as well. So I don't know that the system that we have when we commission things is actually sound. And whether it is in audit terms sound or just sound in practical terms, I'm not really sure. But it seems to me that we do not lose responsibility for some of these things. In the case of a theatre, it's probably not quite so acute, but it could be acute in certain services where the public is depending on us for a service which we normally were face-to-face with, and then we have a third party between us. So all I'm saying is that in the future, I'm grateful for this, that we need to keep a tighter rein on our management of commissioned services, no matter what they are or where they are. And I think that that is our fault, not the fault perhaps of the commissioned body. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, I think the point here that was brought out was that in the contract, for example, we asked for performance data, but we aren't following that through and say, where's the performance data? It's not actually taking responsibility for providing the service yourself. And I think the sloppier you are in asking for that follow-up, the sloppier your contractor could become. Not saying it has in this case, but that was the main point of this. And so it's that contract management I'm talking about rather than getting hands-on. Okay. Anybody else got any comments on this?
Please, it's fundamental in outsourcing contracts, you call them commissioning contracts, that the entity that's putting out the service actually stands there and monitors very carefully what's going on. I absolutely agree with you. I don't think it's the contractor's fault in the last analysis. It is ours. And by the way, if we don't actually engage and enforce a contractual term, there is a pretty good chance that that may wither on the vine and the accountability of the contractor may go down. So it is very, very serious in outsourcing that we're on the ball regularly, and audit should wrap knuckles if that isn't adhered to.
Yes, Councillor English.
Clearly there is a risk that there's sloppiness with actually putting in the secondary processes, shall we say, in terms of actually securing the information. It's not just a one-off with the Hazlitt, but it's actually a possible systemic issue with how our contracts are drawn up. So are we proposing any action to deal with the fact that we are likely, if certain figures actually turn out to be remotely accurate, going to be moving into outsourcing additional areas? Or moving into commercial services ourselves. Are we actually proposing any action to look at whether this possible systemic problem has been in dealing with contracts is being addressed? Because it's not going to be a one-off, is it?
Well, I think we are. When I alluded to officers coming back to us with a statement as to how they see these contracts being managed in the future.
Make that more specific. Will that have a specific remit to include the commercialisation contracts? Because so clearly I think there are very big risks if we go down the same path as hit this with those contracts.
I'll let the office respond to that.
Yes, if I could come back on that. I don't think it's been established that there's a systemic issue about contract management in the council. I think there's a number of contracts that are run very efficiently and where management are very proactive in making sure that we get the best possible deal from the contractors. But clearly an issue has been highlighted about the HASLIT. And on your other point about the lessons to be learned from this for further outsourcing or commercialisation, definitely we would rely on the best practice around the council in putting together any arrangements for outsourcing, monitoring other contracts. So definitely we need to be careful when setting up new arrangements that they are effective, and it's not just the arrangements are there, that they are monitored as the contract is carried out.
So I ask you, Councillor English, would you like to make a recommendation on this particular topic of contract management that we could, in noting this report, we could add to our minutes?
I think I would, Mr Chairman, that we specifically put on record that this committee's request that officers do examine the lessons to be learned from this particular issue and ensure that the best practice from the council is adopted in terms of future, not just establishing but the initial contract, but setting up the reporting processes for those contracts, because that's where it fell down.
How's the rest of the committee feel about that? Yes, Councillor.
If I may probably add to that, if there is going to be any report back on current status, then perhaps we would be interested in making this up as I sit here, the top 10, and is it by cost, the top 10 outsourced contracts, a table showing what the contractual reporting position is and when the last report received and were there many actions. You just give a quality, a feel for what is going on with existing contracts.
Councillor Burton.
I just wanted to make a sort of a slightly more general comment, if I may. You know, we're talking about this particular contract as the example, and I'm being very careful not to stray into territory that might take us to yellow pages. So if we talk about perhaps the viability of that contract and perhaps the consequences if we do consider that it's not the way forwards, and what the challenge from that could be in terms of budget setting or whether we can continue to support it, I believe there are some much bigger issues that we're identifying as an audit hotspot, but my expectation is that the head of service and the relevant committee will be moving it forwards and getting under the surface, and that's the remedy that we're looking for, and it isn't just about monitoring it.
Very briefly, Mr Chairman, I don't disagree with any of that, but I do think there are recommendations which I just set out in terms of general advice in terms of how contracts, not necessarily this specific contract, are actually approached, and we should be putting on record our strong view that the reporting processes are as important as the actual initial clauses in the contract, and that needs to be taken forward as a general approach.
If I might come back, but putting it another way, the lack of compliance with the reporting that the contract demands is fundamentally indicative that the contract, at least in those metrics, is failing, and actually those metrics are of the underlying core issues, and then the remedy is the big decision making about whether one would even continue with such a contract arrangement. I think
that we're really talking about They are different issues. I think we're really just talking about getting officers to ensure that they are attending to the issue that we're raising regarding contract monitoring. I agree with you, Councillor, that if a particular contract looks like it's not performing as it should, then it should be dealt with by the relevant service committee.
And the first thing that would dry up is the reporting that you would expect from the contractor.
Councillor Calling.
I would only observe, I don't know whether everyone's had heavy involvement in outsourcing. I have, and it is normally good practice with any significant contract, significant within the terms of the organisation, to actually require, if anything, monthly reporting, a formal report, stylised report with exceptions blown up. There's nothing wrong with outsourcing, I have to say, but it's only as good as A, the service provider, and B, the client actually watching the situation and keeping the service provider's feet to the fire occasionally.
I'm sure officers are listening very carefully to what you're saying and will consider all of that in assessing whether we have adequate contract monitoring procedures. Is that all right? Yes, Rich.
Might make a suggestion to the committee. Obviously, major contracts form part of our audit universe and are areas that we examine from time to time. Last year, we looked at the leisure centre contract and the waste management contract, for instance, both which we concluded were sound. And so I was wondering if the committee might appreciate at a future meeting we could go back through our recent records on maybe the top 10 contracts as was suggested, and consider what findings we have from the work that we've done, and if we haven't yet done the work, advise members when it will fall due within our audit planning, whether a report of that nature would go some way to assuring the committee.
Well, it would certainly give some reassurance, I would hope, to agree on that. Yes, Councillor Garland.
I think a lot of this is being blown out of all proportion. We have our regular annual audit, and it looks at all of the contracts the council runs, no issues at all. And actually, when it comes down to it, there's a whole raft of issues relating to a contract, the performance of Parkwood, the income it makes, how it makes much of the venue that we ourselves made a decision that we could no longer afford to run. And actually, when it comes down to it, we're looking at some fire doors, which can be easily remedied, picked up, being dealt with. So I think a lot of what is being said tonight is, in my view, blowing much of this out of proportion.
I would draw your attention to the fact that our contract included requests for performance figures, which we never actually asked for. It's that issue that concerns me rather more than particular. It's that sort of monitoring level. And it's the same with possibly with the approach with the 106 agreements. I don't know. I don't want to get into that detail now.
I've got no issue with contract, but it has been suggested elsewhere that this is an issue, I think, is blowing it out of proportion.
I think it might be an organisational issue.
I don't think it is.
Well, in that case, it should be easily evidenced.
Say that may be true, and I hope it is, but I can't see what the harm is in actually flagging up the importance, on this committee's view, that the reporting procedures need to be seriously taken into account when we're looking at particularly moving the council into new areas of business. That if everything's fine, that won't be an additional problem. If it isn't, it's something we should be flagging up, and I would like that included if there isn't a good reason not to include it.
Yes, Councillor.
As a member of the public who uses the cafe in Moat Park, I think it's extremely important that it's run properly, because this is the view the public get of the borough, and I think it is very important that it is run properly. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, the question is, all of this has been carefully minuted. We can ask the officers to note the minutes and respond accordingly and come back to us with their views. I think we should do that rather than include a specific recommendation, given the nature of the topic.
As long as when they come back, we can consider whether we should.
Okay. I would just like to end on this agenda item on a happier note and thank Rich and his department for the performance of your team and what you're achieving, and that you've got your hands on the ball, so to speak. So thank you for that, and I'm sure the committee would join me in thanking you for that. Okay, so we're asked to note the interim internal audit report. Can I take it that that's noted?
With the addition of the comments made in this meeting, Mr. Chairman.
Agreed. You got enough comments there, Debbie? Okay, good. Right, let's move on then. Agenda item 11, the Treasury Management Half-Yearly Review. Mr. Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Council adopted SITFA's Code of Practice on Treasury Management, which recommends that a minimum of half and yearly reviews are reported to the Audit, Governance and Standards Committee. This report details the activities of the Treasury Management function for the first 6 months of 2016-17. The key points I'll give you now. The Bank of England base rate fell to 0.25% back in August this year. This has led to a reduction in money market fund returns across the board. As at the 30th of September 2016, the Council has total investments of £25.25 million. A list of these investments can be shown within Appendix 1. Average rate of Council investments is currently 0.77. However, this is likely to fall once current investments are renewed at a lower rate. Total investment income as at 30th September is £106,000 compared to a budget of £135,000. So far this year, it's not been necessary for the authority to borrow. The current advice from our Treasury advisors is to keep investments short-term and to run down balances to fund the capital programme. This in turn will reduce counterparty risks. As rates are looking to be low for quite a while, we would look to borrow as and when we need to. That's all I've got to say. I'm open to any questions people may have.
Councillor English.
I don't have a question as such, although I would say that's an excellent report. I would just note that purely from a technical, and I know this is very pedantic, but recommendation 2 is not actually formulated in the form of a recommendation, which is what I think I said earlier. It should actually say something like that the committee agree that no amendments to the current procedures are necessary. I know this is perhaps pedantic, but committee resolutions should be formulated in the correct sense to actually be legal, and particularly on audit committees.
Shall we just remove that then? Is that what you're suggesting, Councillor? Shall we just remove item 2?
It should say that the committee agree no amendments up to the strategy are needed. To the current procedures are necessary. It's just purely a grammatical thing, really. But these things, recommendations should be in grammatical sentences and start with the committee agrees.
Is that agreed? All right. Anybody got any other comments? Councillor Cooley.
I have to preface this by saying I don't know what I'm talking about, okay? Yeah, as usual. Page 48, and it'll be an absolutely stupid question. The table on 48, looking at the rates of return, the two at the top of the page, which are 2 years, are about 1/3%. And we're talking small beer. Let's be clear. And I can't gainsay this. It's probably absolutely the correct investment profile, but they stand out as incredibly low. I don't know a lot about this, but I believe there are bond markets of a year, 2-year maturity. Maybe they're deemed to be higher risk, or they're not available to local councils, I don't know, which offer far more than this. So there's some outliers there, which I'm sure are correct, but they look odd. Thank you.
Yes, what that is, the top two are money market funds, where the funds are spread over a large portfolio of institutions. So they are actually AAA rated. So Arlene Close gives a maximum of 2-year duration. But as these are money market funds, these are actually instant access accounts. So we can recall the funds back straight away, hence why the rates are so low.
My follow-on question, if I may, does the borough need such instantly recoverable, I think it was 16 million, correct me if I'm right. Again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it looks as if we're not getting a lot from our investments. If we have to have all of this sitting there short-term so we can get it tomorrow morning, fair enough. I will shut up now, but it looks odd.
Mr. Owen?
Yes, what usually happens because of presets happening each month, business rates, payments as well, those funds do fluctuate. They go up to a limit and then they come down to almost zero. The rest of the funds we put on fixed term are ones that we don't actually need on a daily basis.
Councillor Daly.
Well, Chairman, I'm not a financier, but I've always understood, in fact, that so far as we're concerned, we should not speculate, and that is the big problem for us, because we could have put money down a year ago at the bookies on Mr. Trump becoming President of the United States, and our problems would have been over for the next 25 years. But we didn't, and we couldn't, and that's the matter. But we have to conserve what we have, and unfortunately put it on deposit, and we've heard what it is. It's very low return. I have to tell you, I mean, I'm very delighted because my solar panels, in fact, have given me a 19% return on my capital over the last 5 years. So there you go.
Foresight's a wonderful thing. I have got a couple of quick questions. On page 44, paragraph 2.4.2, you say the Council is currently operating at 32 basis points above this rate, the rate being 0.5828, presumably, above it, but this is unlikely to be sustainable. Have you found it there, John? So, you've got it? So if I add those two together, I get something like 0.9. Is that what you're saying? We're getting 0.9?
No, that's our. This is what we benchmark our investments against. It just looks like at the moment we're doing very well, but what I'm saying there is we got one investment, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which we took out 2 years ago, which is currently running at 1.44%. That comes to an end in March next year, so that will reduce our average rate considerably once that matures.
Okay, and the other question I've got is, you've got, again on page 44, you've got a table of PWLB borrowing rates. What rate or what term would NBC anticipate going to if we start borrowing money, and therefore what rate are we likely to face?
So it would depend on the nature of the investment, but typically where we're making decisions, we're looking at longer term borrowing of 25 to 50 years plus.
25 to 50. Okay, thanks. Anybody got any other points on this? No? So we're asked, with the amendment suggested by Councillor English, firstly to note the position of the Treasury Management Strategy as at the 30th of September. Is that agreed? And secondly, the committee agrees no amendments to the current procedures are necessary as a result of the review of activities in 2016-17. Agreed? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, agenda item 12. The Auditors' Annual Audit Letter.
This report sets out in summary form the different audit work that has been carried out in respect of 2015-16. So it summarises all the information that the auditors have done. This material the committee will already have seen at previous meetings, so there's no new material here. It just pulls together all of the work that auditors have done for us. So if members have any questions, Matt Dean from Grant Thornton is here. He can answer specific questions that there may be on the report.
Councillor Garland.
It arises from this letter, but Mark Green may be better able to respond to the question. On page 62, and this, my question centres on income generation. In the second paragraph, underneath findings and conclusions, it says that of the £2.2 million that we've had to find for this financial year that we're currently in, £679,000 comes from additional income generation, which is excellent and gives credence and reason to pursue the commercialisation agenda. But further down the page, it says in the final paragraph that the Council has set a target of delivering £1 million of additional income over the medium term, of which it reports £460,000 has been delivered to date. Which indicates that actually over £1 million of additional income has actually been achieved or is to be achieved by the end of the financial year 2016-17. So this gives the idea that we've actually, or will have achieved in a little over 5 or 6 months, the actual £1 million target. I don't think that is the case, so I think there's a discrepancy in there, and I think it's important to understand, maybe not for this particular letter, but for future reports on commercialisation and income generation, that the breakdown of the income received is either a one-off contribution to the council coffers, or it is actually a stream of income that can be base budgeted for. I don't think that distinction is made. I don't expect it to be made in here, but just something that arose when I was reading this, and I've got no issues with the letter, it's excellent, but just it gives the indication that we will have achieved by the end of 2017, 4th of April, or whatever, £1.2 million worth of income generation. Now, I know that's not the case, but I think we need a distinction to be made between income generation that is a one-off or is actually a stream that can be base budgeted for.
Thank you, Councillor. The two paragraphs are describing slightly different things. The second paragraph describes income generation in 16-17, which includes items which weren't part of the commercialisation agenda. Moving on to the paragraph at the bottom, this specifically relates to commercialisation, and of course the £1 million, as it says, is over the medium term, so it's not referring specifically to 16-17. Yes, the 460,000 has been delivered, but as I say, that is only part of the additional income that's referred to above of 679,000. It's referring to what has been categorised as commercialisation income. For greater clarity, there will be a report, and in fact it's been published already, going to Policy and Resources Committee this Wednesday, which is setting out progress with the commercialisation agenda. So I hope that will shed a bit more light on where we're at with it.
Okay. No other comments to make? Okay, so we're being asked to consider the External Auditor's Annual Audit Letter for the year ending 31st March 2016 as Appendix 1 to this report.
Recommendation, Mr. Chairman, because we've just considered it, so we need to say whether we accept it or not, don't we?
You want to consider it and agree it, do you?
Well, we've just considered it, so the recommendation must be something other than consider it. So I would suggest that the committee agrees the external auditors or accepts the external auditor's annual audit letter. Accepts would be the better term.
Accept, you rather we changed considers to accepts?
Yes.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay.
Would you like a comma anywhere?
Well, we can't have a recommendation to consider it because we've just done it. No, I don't want that word again.
Councillor Burton. Yeah,
right, it does now. I was actually going to ask the report author or whoever is here for that purpose what you're asking us to do, because it's quite clear you asked us just to consider it. We've given it some consideration. Are we actually being asked to agree this letter, or we don't? It's not even being requested of us, is it? So I don't know why we're...
The committee is being asked to note the report. I think that's probably a better term to use than considers.
Mr. Chairman, if we're being asked to accept the report, we should accept the report, not just note it. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything.
The purpose of presenting the report is to give members an opportunity to comment on the contents in the way that that has been done for officers or for the auditor to answer any questions on it. I don't believe it's a question of accepting it, because the letter has already been submitted by Grant Thornton. I accept that we use note fairly generally for reports like this, but I think in this case it probably is the correct term.
Okay, in this case it may actually be just about acceptable, and I'm not going to argue about it, but I have to say that we use note for 99% of our recommendations, and it's got to stop because it is so broad it's almost meaningless. But on this case it might actually be the right term.
Councillor Revell.
Well, the word note may be misused in many cases, I don't know, but I think in this case it's absolutely the right word to use, and I don't know quite why we're having this long debate about it. Let's get on with it.
Okay, is that agreed? Agreed?
Agreed. It's a pity to lose what Councillor Garland actually commented on, because I think we've considered it. It looks wonderful. But in fact, I do agree there's a lack of clarity in terms of whether these figures are so annualised figures, one-off figures, recurring figures, or whatever. So I think it's fine, but maybe Grant Thornton next time could do better and explain it better to us.
There is an outstanding action, which actually I brought up at the last committee meeting, to substantiate the 460,000 of commercialisation income, and I'm told that that's all going to be revealed at the next P&R meeting. And we'll be some of us will be in a better position to interpret the auditor's letter when we see that. Okay, moving on then. We're on 13. Okay, agenda item 13. Sorry? Okay, all right. So you want the auditor to comment on this, do you? Okay, I call upon our auditors to comment on this.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. This is just a very brief update to sort of let the committee know where we are in terms of our 16-17 work programme to date. Pages 72 and 73 set out what will be required to deliver during this financial year. The main sort of work will start in earnest in January 2017 with our interim visit, which will obviously then lead towards the final accounts visit in July 2017. And then the rest of the report is just some key sector issues and updates that we've brought to your attention. So that's all I wanted to say on that. Happy to take any questions or comments.
This is your annual advert, isn't it? I just realised. Anybody have any comments? Can we use the word notes again? Are we all happy to note this report? Is that agreed then? Thank you very much.
Chairman, for the purposes of those who are in Singapore or wherever watching all this, enjoying it, I want to put them to bed. I think they should read something like the committee notes the external auditor's update and report, has enjoyed reading it and recommends it for insomniacs.
Okay, members, I think that's it for today. Thank you very much for your attendance and attention, and I close the meeting.